Welcome. Everyone, welcome. Do we have a mic? Yes, we do.
You have to speak. You have to really get right up into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Welcome. It is Friday, April 13th at 3 o'clock, and this is panel 5307, The Age of Nationalism. My name is Benjamin Teitelbaum, and I'm an assistant professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs here at CU Boulder. As a scholar of radical nationalist movements, I'm especially happy to be moderating today's panel. Our title could, as well in my mind, have ended with a question mark. We are here to ponder the causes, the trajectory, the shape of nationalist movements throughout the globe today, and whether or not they are, in fact, definitive of world affairs at this moment. And helping us to explore those and other questions is an exceptional panel. I assume those of you who have been attending the conference up to this point might have seen some of our panelists already. I will introduce them briefly nonetheless, and I do encourage you to go to the CWA app to look at their full biographies, because each one of them has a biography that extends well beyond what we can accommodate in this brief introduction here. Starting furthest out to my left, Heather Holbert is a national security policy expert who, among other appointments, served in the White House and State Department under President Bill Clinton. In addition to directing a policy advocacy initiative, she's also a frequent public commentator, I should also add, with a sizable Twitter following, with a podcast and a column in New York Magazine. To her right, we have Jeff Engel, a presidential historian at Southern Methodist University. Jeff was the featured speaker at the reception for the International Affairs program held last night, and there was a lot of positive feedback after his visit there. If you even take a quick glance at his biography, will note that he's a prolific author. He's written or edited 10 books on American foreign policy. He's currently working on text due out from Oxford University Press called Seeking Monsters to Destroy: How America Goes Off to War from Jefferson to Obama. And to his right, we have Ambassador Ross Wilson. He's devoted much of his diplomatic and scholarly career to the post-Soviet world and surrounding states. He served as American ambassador to Azerbaijan and Turkey during the George W. Bush administration and directed the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center from 2010 to 2014. He remains a distinguished fellow at the Council today, and among other engagements also serves as a visiting lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make an opening statement. Afterwards, we will have a discussion amongst themselves. I will have questions for them, and then finally, at the conclusion of our session today, we will open up the panel to questions from you, the audience. I do want to note one unfortunate change to our schedule. Unfortunately, we will lose Heather Holbert about halfway into about half an hour into our session, rather. But we will hopefully get a good chance to hear her thoughts. And with that, I will turn the mic over to her now.
Great. This is amazing turnout for a panel this late in the week. So, yeah, look, I'm talking about you. So thank you all, and thank you for another fantastic week here at CWA, where I've learned an enormous amount, and I do apologize. We're stretching this out as far as we can. I'm making the student driver take the toll road. So let me jump in. I really wanted to stay for this panel because I think the topic of how we understand the way nationalism is acting in our time is incredibly important, and I think you're going to hear really amazing contributions from everyone on this panel. And so I wanted to kick us off with a little bit of a quick around the world. And nationalism can mean many things, which the academics on the panel are much more equipped to break down for you than I am. And so I want to use a very specific sub-definition. And so what I'm talking about are nationalist movements within a society which are making a particular religio-ethnic subset of the nation the focus of their nationality. So this is, in a way, kind of a movement backwards from the thing that we thought we were seeing or hoped we were seeing over the last 100 years or so, a movement toward the understanding of nation and nationalism as something that could be larger than ethnicity or religion. So I won't spend too much time on the United States, although obviously there's a lot to say, and I think my colleagues will have a lot to say. So just for fun, to start someplace completely different, I'd like to start in Japan, which of course we think of in the past as having had a rather famous nationalism with some rather militaristic and painful outcomes. And in Japan today, we see a nationalism resurgent, which not only wants to change the Japanese constitution to return to Japan being able to undertake offensive military operations, but also wants to do some other things to the constitution, like, for example, removing the stipulation of equal rights for women. That's kind of fun, isn't it? You move a little south from Japan and you move on to the Philippines, whose strongman leader is quite well known. Again, one of the really salient points about nationalism in the current age is that he was popularly elected and remains quite popular in the Philippines, despite really carrying out sort of quite alarming, not just rhetorical campaigns against subsets of the population. We could move west from there to India, where the traditional Congress Party, which has always prided itself on being a not so much post-nationalist, but really defining a very strong Indian nationalism in a non-ethnic, non-religious way, that party is really in ruins right now. For reasons that have much to do with its own complacency and corruption, but do also have something to do with the potency of nationalist appeals to the silent or forgotten or underserved, quote unquote, in all cases, Hindu majority in India. And so you have having over a sort of 20 or 30 year game plan, you have a political party now holding power in India, which frankly, grew up on the foundations of a nationalist organization which, from its founding, avowedly supported the use of violence to Hindu nationalist ends. And you now have this totally well-respected political party that everyone from around the world is happy to meet with in India as the great rising democracy, the great counterweight to China, the great pillar of the liberal order, except that its own attitudes on sort of majoritarian democracy are very different from what we have been used to thinking of as liberal democracy in a multi-ethnic sense. We can sweep on west from India, and we'll pass over Turkey, which Russ knows well and may want to comment on. I'm a little abashed to talk about Turkey with him on the panel. It's certainly another interesting example, and you should ask him questions about it. We'll then pause over Israel, whose prime minister recently thought it was a good way to criticize a nonprofit organization by saying, this organization wants Israel to be a democracy of all its citizens. Which is a rather amazing statement, although it's one that, as I say, all these other regimes I've mentioned would immediately understand. And then we move north from there to Europe, and starting in the post-Soviet space with Poland and Hungary, Hungary just this past week, we saw an election where the rightist party in government and its even more far-right sister party, on the basis of campaigning that included alarming ethnic and religious rhetoric, now controls 65% of the seats in parliament and is now able to rewrite the rules so that it can win elections in perpetuity, which is a success of nationalist democracy that I really don't think we've seen anywhere else in the developed world, where a democracy has basically voted itself out of democracy. And that Hungary is a small country, but it is a member of the EU and it is a member of NATO, and so that poses some very interesting challenges to how we think about the solidarity of quote-unquote liberal democracies in the West. Poland shares some of the characteristics of the Hungarian situation, although Polish civil society has fought back more and more successfully, and the power of an ethno-nationalist right is nowhere near as consolidated in Poland as it is in Hungary. But those two governments have been able to, they're basically, each is able to prevent the EU, the European Union, from taking any punitive action against the other. So what we thought, or what Europeans thought, they had erected this wonderful corpus of laws and norms to guard against the resurgence of nationalism, but it turns out all it takes is two governments to sort of stop that in its tracks. We then move further west to a set of governments where we had elections in the last year, since the US presidential elections, which featured surging right-wing nationalist parties, again, employing the same kinds of ethnic and religious rhetoric about who is really a citizen, who is the first quality of citizen. And in the case of France, in the case of Germany, in the case of the Netherlands, in the case of Austria, in the far-right party didn't come to power, and there was a great sighing of relief and wiping of brows. But in each of those places, with the exception of France, the far right is in a stronger position than it has ever been. And so there was a general feeling, particularly after the French and German elections, that we had dodged a bullet in Europe. But that's really the wrong metaphor, or if the bullet is the metaphor, the bullet is still ricocheting around the room. And I think I've come pretty near to the end of my 7 minutes, so I'll make a couple of concluding points. One of which is we need to understand this sort of contemporary ethno-nationalism as not a uniquely American phenomenon. And I should add, there are ties. American conservative activists are helping create a CPAC-like organization in Japan. American activists have been involved in the Hungarian and Polish elections. There are very tight electoral ties between Hindu expat groups in the US, with ties both to the movement that spawned the current Indian government and to conservative politics in the US. So we are so used in the United States to thinking of ourselves as unique, and we're in this development, which I find very unnerving personally. We are not unique at all. We are part of a global web, and as we think about how we want to respond to the age of nationalism, that response is probably not going to be successful if we think about it only within our own country. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out to talk about what is clearly, as you can tell by the attendance, an uninteresting and unimportant topic. I speak, of course, about nationalism, and today I want to really pick up on my colleague's excellent tour de horizon and her discussion of the way that nationalism is on the rise around the world, to express why there were so many sighs and so many wipings of brows, if you will, after in many of these countries nationalist movements did not take power. And that basically is to discuss why it is historically, that's my point of view, I'm a historian, why it is historically, at least in the 20th century, we have traditionally equated nationalism with bad. Why we traditionally consider nationalism to be something that needs to be eradicated. It's a disease, if you will, throughout most of the 20th century. And in fact, the successes of the 20th century historically have been founded on that very eradication of that disease. As, say, when nationalism is suppressed, the story of the 20th century I'm about to tell you would suggest, that is when peace and prosperity have flourished. And I want to begin this discussion in Europe, source of nationalism, one might argue, at least modern colonialism, and consequently also source of a tremendous amount of violence. You do not need to spend much time studying the 20th century or before to recognize that Europe has a habit of launching great wars against itself about every 20, 30 years or so, at least going back to the 16th century. And after World War I would argue, European policymakers didn't know what they had just done, but they didn't like it. But they also were not entirely sure that they hadn't done it the wrong way. That is to say, if the entire notion of World War I had been we had broken up into too many alliances and then thought that we could get through a war quickly, which actually, of course, leads to 4 years of stalemate and death and horror, perhaps the problem was the 4 years of death and horror. That is to say, maybe we just need better tactics. Maybe we need to find a way to solve our problems, still militarily, but of course, much more quickly. World War II abused them of this notion entirely. That is to say, World War II, I like to think of it as the second opportunity that Europe had to commit societal suicide in the 20th century. And most European policymakers came to the inevitable conclusion that they were not likely in an atomic age to survive a third. Consequently, this is where I would draw the origins of the European Union in a modern sense. And we can find its origins being talked about in a theoretical sense in centuries before. But certainly I would date it, if you will, to the immediate post-war period. And in fact, a particular reconciliation, if you will, between the Germans and the French, not so much over a recognition that they shared anything in terms of identity, but rather that they shared a lot in terms of space and resource needs. So consequently, the first move for reconciliation in Europe, unification in a sense of Europe, as a way to diminish the fear of nationalism, was not to eradicate nationalism itself. That is to say, it was not an effort to get rid of the idea that I am a German or I am a Frenchman. It was essentially to tie my own hands, if I am either, by integrating the coal and steel industries of both countries. The idea being that you effectively cannot go to war without either coal or steel. And if our countries are completely integrated in those two areas, that makes it really hard to go to war. Now, I should point out that this, of course, is coming at the end of a long half-century which had seen European economies more integrated than ever before. But at the very least, they decided to focus on these two what are considered to be critical areas. And from that, I would argue the entire European effort to move away from nationalism was begun essentially by adding more and more players into a larger and larger economic model. And the idea was that over time, of course, and as this blossomed from just a coal and steel environment into a broader European market and then the European Union as we come to know it, we would transform people's very identities from not just French coal users or German coal users, but more importantly into Europeans. And that would actually be the way that we would eliminate essentially the identities that were dangerous within nationalism. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you, my colleague has just explained that those forces of nationalism are not only on the rise throughout Europe, but more importantly have, I think, with the Brexit vote in particular, have managed to, if you will, start to unravel the very recipe for peace that policymakers after 1945 rested peace upon. That is to say, nationalism, the idea that we would have a European identity, has, with the British leaving, taken a significant hit. And of course, I think it's no surprise, therefore, that we're seeing nationalism rise in other areas. But at the same time this is going on, I want to explain, to my eyes, how this looks from the American perspective. That is to say, to take a broad view of American policymakers over generations and how they viewed the problem of nationalism, because they too viewed it as an intertwined economic and identity problem, if you will, but has somewhat different solutions, both of which, by the way, I would argue are currently being undermined as well. At the end of the First World War, the general consensus of American policymakers, led by Woodrow Wilson, was that nationalism had been, in fact, the cause of the First World War, and that therefore we needed to ensure that nations could speak for themselves and could have a representative voice for themselves. And as you know, that plan largely came to naught after World War I, but was revived after World War II by Franklin Roosevelt, a Wilson disciple, as the United Nations, as a place where all nations could speak together. More importantly, from their perspective, that is the Roosevelt administration's perspective, that may have been a nice idea to have nations talk, but they too believed that we need to also have nations trade. But their decision was essentially, in a sense, different from the European decision. The European decision to say we're going to integrate forcefully our economies so they can't pull them together. American policymakers after World War II came to the general conclusion that when countries do not trade together, that is when they fight against each other. Consequently, the entire liberal economic order that was constructed on American lines after World War II was based upon the idea of opening up markets, opening up free trade, opening up currencies, allowing the interchange of ideas and the interchange, more importantly, of stuff. Because as long as stuff was interchanged, you know what else would happen? Ideas would be interchanged. And therefore, we begin to recognize that when I, as a business person, would go to another country to sell my stuff, I might notice those people are not so different than myself. And more importantly, I like their money, and they like my stuff, so we have something in common. And therefore, we would start to think of ourselves as, perhaps, if you will, global citizens. Even if we like to salute our own flag, we would think of ourselves as being too integrated and economically intertwined to think about going to war again against other countries. But there's one additional kicker to this argument, which is that that too seemed a little bit of a pie-in-the-sky theory to most American policymakers, and they wanted some guarantee. That is to say, you could tell me that countries that trade with each other will not fight, and you could tell me that countries that think of themselves as having an equal sovereign voice will not fight, but I'd really like to be, if you will, the big kid on the block who makes sure they don't fight. Consequently, the history of American foreign policy after 1945, in Europe at least, I would argue, is one of ensuring that no matter what happens on the continent of Europe, the home of nationalism, that American power was dominant. That is the entire reason, I would argue, for the creation of an American permanent military presence in Europe, and that is the entire reason for the formation of NATO. Now, you might have heard this wonderful piece of propaganda that suggested that NATO existed and was created to keep the Soviets out. Nah. It actually was enabled to keep the Americans not just in, and not just the Germans down, as the phrase goes, but the Americans on top of it all. Why? Because American policymakers believed that when they left after World War I, they left a recipe and an environment primed for war again. And when they stayed after World War II, war did not occur subsequently, because we were the dominant power. This is why I am particularly concerned not only about the rise of nationalism in Europe, and as you pointed out, in Asia as well, but also in this country, because I would argue that the current administration is directly trying to undermine those two central pillars of American-led stability in the world designed to undermine nationalism after World War II. That is to say, they are attacking the very notion of integrated free trade, imposing the same tariffs, if you will, that policymakers in the Roosevelt and subsequent administrations believed was the direct cause, in many ways, of World War II. And, of course, they are trying to diminish the power of international alliances, which, of course, those international alliances have been designed in many ways to ensure that the United States was there to keep the peace and keep nationalism down. Consequently, the surge of what I would argue is nationalism within our country, as evidenced by our current administration, that in essence is destroying the very premise of American peace and stability after World War II, designed to eliminate nationalism through American-led power and American-led trade. I'll stop there.
Just in the nick of time. Well, welcome to this session, and I want to thank the organizers of the Conference on World Affairs for the opportunity to come here. This is my first time, and it's been an extremely interesting week. One of the sessions earlier this week dealt with the matter of secession movements around the world. In a couple of different panels, I've been part of discussion about Turkey and developments there. And obviously there's a significant set of issues related to Islam and nationalism that kind of get bollocksed up. We can come back to some of those. What I thought in my opening piece here was to come at this in a somewhat different way from my colleagues, which is to talk about American nationalism. That would be Make America Great Again. That would be America First. American nationalism is a little bit different from some of the things that my colleagues are talking about. We're not a single ethnicity. American nationalism, at least historically, America is an idea or a set of values, or at least that's kind of been where we have been. Make America great. All of us want for America to be great. Make it America again. We thought it was great. Make America first. You know, of course, America should be first on the list of priorities that senior policymakers have when they think about the problems that our country faces, the problems we face in the world, the welfare, the security, the prosperity of our country should always be at the top of their agenda. But for a variety of reasons relating to the pressures and changes my colleagues have referred to, you've had the rise of something in this country that's reflected in those slogans, America First, and Make America Great Again. And I will talk about what some of these issues are, partly as phenomena that I think have given rise to what we see behind those slogans, the phenomena we see behind those slogans, Make America Great Again, America First, but also, I would argue, areas where genuine American nationalists need to dedicate their attention to solving some of the problems that I will refer to. Problem number one, of course, is dysfunctional government. Congress that it seems unable to pass legislation, seems unable to enact a budget, an erratic chief executive who lurches from one problem to another, senior leaders underneath who seem, for a variety of reasons, in the present administration especially having to do with the turmoil at the top. In the previous administration there were some other causes, but unable to do the planning, the execution, the follow-through, the foresight looking ahead, or maybe not unable, but certainly unable to do an adequate job of those things. A second set of matters related to our economy, debt. A debt problem we are not addressing, entitlement issues we are not addressing, infrastructure issues we're not addressing. Americans frustrated by that. Again, in my personal view, genuine nationalists tackle that just as they ought to work to address dysfunctional government. American nationalism, in my view, also should include and must include engagement on the world stage. My colleague has referred to NATO. NATO, a part of one of a number of alliances, a web of alliances with America at the hub. That fact, the fact of the alliances, the fact that America is at the center of those, an immense source of influence, an immense source of ability for the United States to shape the international environment, to address our problems. And those allies are important. As one observer said, to the extent that America First gives rise to the conclusion that what the rest of the world thinks ranks second, we have a problem. And again, here I think real nationalists recognize that. There's the matter of the global economy, global trade, the trading system, the rules we wrote, the dollar that underpins the global economy, incredibly important sources of American prosperity. The trade, of course, also an incredible source of American frustration, something that I particularly see in Wisconsin, in the heartland, affected in different ways, perhaps than in other parts of the country. And then you have the challenge of China and how that has buffeted America. Then another challenge that I think real American nationalists have is the matter of word and the words we use. An erratic, unpredictable cacophony of statements, of tweets, of taunts, of threats, creating unreliability about America's word and the durability of America's word, adding, I think, significantly to our challenges. Again, in my personal view, genuine American nationalists pursue a different course. And then there's the lack of strategy, which is not a problem that originates in the current administration, a lack of strategy on critical problems like trade, like Syria, like Russia, like China, even North Korea. Cool-headed, comprehensive, rational thinking about the world in which we actually live in, the outcomes that we would like to see, and some really critical thinking about the levers we have to influence those problems. That's part of American nationalism too, or it certainly should be. And then last is the power of the American idea, to come back, America, country of ideas. The power of America's example. Joe Nye writes a lot about this in pieces he writes about American soft power, significantly undermined by attacks on the free media, demonization of political opponents, questions about respect for the rule of law. That power of American example actually came up in one of the previous sessions I was in today, and I had a contrary thought. It's not all that bad. The power of American example remains compelling all around the world. The Me Too movement that started here has been replicated in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. It wasn't a made in the US government thing. It was people who did that. And the power of that example, I think, remains compelling. I'll close with this. A number of months ago, I saw the film Bridge of Spies that features Tom Hanks playing the character of James Donovan, an interesting guy who'd been a prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials. He negotiates the release of Gary Francis Powers, the U-2 pilot who was shot down over the Soviet Union, in exchange for Rudolf Abel and a couple of other people. A tough as nails, America First nationalist who helped to establish the CIA and the way that it functions. And in his memoirs, he writes, if the free world is not faithful to its moral code, there remains no society for which others may hunger. That's American nationalism. It's an important force in the world, and it plays off against some of these awful things that we've seen in other parts of the world, awful tensions created by some of the same forces that have driven a negative kind of American nationalism here that I think we have to understand and find ways to address.
Thank you both, and it is a shame that we had to lose Heather for this panel, but in honor of her brief participation, I'd like to ask our remaining two panelists a question coming from her statement to us. One of the benefits of that overview she gave was to let us know that the developments, the experiences that we're having right now in America are not uniquely American. One might even want to extend that to point out that nor are we at the vanguard in any sense of time. This is nothing necessarily new that we are leading. And if indeed that is the case, if this nationalist movement is neither initiated, this new nationalist movement is neither initiated by the United States nor specific to it, panelists, what role can the United States take in leading some sort of response to this rise of global nationalism?
I think the best strategy for leading the tide away from nationalism is exactly what the ambassador just suggested, that the United States needs to act as an example, not to force other nations to be like us, but to make other nations want to be like us. And it sounds simple, hard to do, but that, as he pointed out, has been at the very essence, if you will, of American appeal and American power, I would argue, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st at least. I'd also remind nationalists that we are incredibly powerful. We are incredibly powerful economically, culturally, and especially these days militarily. I'm a tad bit worried, more than a tad actually, that we have actually started to go down the path or continued down the path that Paul Kennedy outlined in his famous 1987 work, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in which he described how great powers that were built up by industry, built up by education, built up by the proper use of resources, and by a healthy dose of nationalism, that they in time were undermined by the fact that they stopped doing those things and started instead spending more time collecting rents from the world, that is, getting money back from their investments, but more importantly, spending more on their militaries. Why? Because they could use that industrial and economic and educational power to create force to compel others. Well, as we know from Thucydides, compulsion only works so long. And I think that we are in an age where America still has the power to compel should we need to, but we'd be much better off not having to.
The only thing I'd add to what I said earlier is I think that America needs to work with its allies to actually solve problems. And to the extent that problems aren't solved in this country, to the extent that the problems are not solved in Europe, that they are not addressed elsewhere among countries that are our friends and partners in the world, people will look elsewhere for other answers. And frankly, to the extent that democracy isn't working, they're going to look elsewhere. Maybe not in America. I hope not in America, but certainly that's what's happening. Heather referred to Hungary, Poland, many questions. Elsewhere around the world, Turkey. Solving the problems is essential. Helping our partners address change, showing leadership. Every country I ever served in, people were pining, and governments, friendly governments, pining for American leadership. And showing it is, I think, a big part of the answer, showing it towards solving problems.
Jeff, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, unfortunately, I suspect we're going to agree on almost everything this afternoon, which makes for a very uninteresting panel. But I want to extend upon that point to say that American leadership is particularly crucial, but it's also, I think, one of the things that the current wave of those who claim American nationalism, I would put the president in this as leader of this movement, that they feel that responsibility to lead has actually been too much of a burden. Why should we have to do it? Why can't the rest of the world take care of itself? Well, there's actually a very good reason why. First of all, because we're bigger and stronger. But the more important reason is because you don't want the rest of the world solving its own problems because they tend to do it wrong. We have had a very successful run when the world runs through us. And as long as the world runs through us, we know that we can help manage the outcomes. Where are we now not? I'll tell you where we're not. We're not at the negotiation table in Syria. So we have no influence on how that turns out, which means there's no one there to argue an American nationalist position. So yes, it is a burden, but I'm reminded of the wonderful words of Spider-Man, who said, with great power comes great responsibility. And frankly, we want it, or should.
Again, there's a lot of threads to move out from those comments there. But if we go back to this initial question of the United States and essentially, Ross, your point and your point, Jeff, that Americanism might be one of the solutions or responses to nationalism. If we lead with our best foot forward, the rest of the world will follow. I think it's important to note, perhaps, that in the United States, we have two understandings of nationalism and what it means to be an American. We can have that more open definition, where we are defined by our ideals, the things that we believe in, affirmation of the Constitution, and so on, civic nationalism. But we also always have, it's not new with Trump, have had an ethno-religious nationalism here too. It's what Heather was referring to at the beginning of her opening statement. There are those who have a more fixed notion of what it means to be a true American. It can be coded in racial terms. It can mean that you are white. It can also be coded in religious terms that we're far more familiar hearing in public debate. What do we do on the global stage when we have that division sewn into our DNA here at home? Is that not a problem?
I think that's part of the wonderful fabric of our country. We are a diverse country, and we're diverse also in the ways in which we define what our country is. That's a source of strength. Yes, it produces some tension, some cacophony and noise in the messages that we convey and the policies we pursue. And that makes us like lots of other countries. One of the things that came out in the panel on secessionist movements was the thought that one of the reasons why you see a lot of movements for secession is because there's so many states that are multinational. In fact, most states are multinational, multi-ethnic. Well, America is multi-ethnic. just as, but we have these competing ideas about who we are, and that is an additive to to what we bring to the table, in my opinion. It's not a very good answer, but it's someone I'll offer.
Well, I think it's a great answer, not least because it's right. But also, again, as a historian, I always tell my students when we discuss these topics every semester, and unfortunately we discuss these topics every semester, which makes me look at them and say, why weren't you listening last semester? That in every generation of American history, beginning, let's start with 1650, the definition of America has been fixed by those who are here, and then repelling those who are not like that within that sphere. And in every generation, the sphere expands. So my favorite example, frankly, are the Irish, who we all know, if this is 1847, are scum and degenerates and drunks and can never be good Americans. You're not supposed to say that out loud today because you know the Irish are within the sphere of what is an American, but you would not have thought that if you were a good Anglo-Protestant in 1847, the know-nothings, if you will. So we always have to remember that we are expanding our definition, but that this is a constant tension in American history. But I also want to point out why we need to keep forcing the expansion of that if we actually want to keep America great, not make it a great again, but keep it great. Because that appeal, that draw, that notion that we can expand the sphere of what is an American has been one of the prime magnets, if you will, not just of people from around the world, but the best people. Boy, I sound like Trump. The best people from around the world. Because remember, the people who have the gumption and the energy historically to leave everything they know and try something new, they're the ones you really want. They're the ones with the highest, let's say, get up and go. And consequently, we used to draw them, in particular, after 1945 in particular, to our educational system. And so it was a marvelous thing that the best minds in the world wanted to come to the United States. They still do, but I have to tell you, as an educator working at a university, our international applicants are way down. Because people around the world who are the best and brightest, who 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 20 years ago would have come here, are both A, worried about whether it's safe, and B, worried about whether or not they could actually stay. And again, if you're concerned about putting up barriers to keep people out, what you're really doing is keeping the best people out. And those are the people who are going to drive the engine of American innovation forward. So to put it more directly, if you wanted to construct a strategy for how to destroy American strength and power in the world in the 21st century, you could not come up with a better strategy than the current administration's.
Another way to have, I think, rephrased the title of this panel that might in some way get at the intention behind it could have been, we could have called it the problem of nationalism. We've been speaking about nationalism up until this point as a problem, with a slight exception, I think, in your statements, Ambassador Wilson. Looking beyond the idealistic American nationalism that we've spoken of, can you find anything good in this nationalist wave that's coming across? After all, someone might say that if nationalism has as its opponent globalization or globalism, that's motivated. People criticize globalism and globalization from a number of perspectives. So once again, is there something good to be seen in what is going on around the world?
Well, I'm going to focus on the United States in particular.
Go for it.
I think that there are several good things that one can point to, silver linings, if you will. Obviously, this room is an example of the fact that more people are engaged around the country in the issues of politics, and more importantly, to follow on from what the ambassador was saying earlier, to help define what it is their version of American nationalism actually means. That is to say, I think you could argue that those, and here I think we're in complete agreement, who believed that the United States' great appeal was as an idea, and that anyone could be an American so long as you followed through with those ideas and respected other Americans' right to follow through with those ideas. We have gotten lazy. because we just presumed that everyone believed that. And it has become obvious that not everybody does. So I think it's good that we listen more, but I also think it's good that we state our case more forcefully. Frankly, I'm always amazed by the discussion about what should or should not be allowed to be discussed on a college campus, because the answer is quite obvious. It should be everything. Why? Because that's where the best ideas win. And I would put, again, I'll speak for you, I would put our idea of nationalism up against the more virulent kind, if you will, in a debate, and I'm quite confident in the result.
I'll add a couple of thoughts. At a certain level, there's nothing wrong with nationalism. And I put together my opening thoughts about what I think real American nationalism ought to be. I think it's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong. And in a world where there is rapid change, and for those of us who went to the first session about on Monday about clean energy and change, there sounds like there's going to be a lot of change. The change that we've undergone in the last 20 years will continue to accelerate more and more and more, and it's all over the world, and people have a tough time dealing with it. And at a certain level, there's nothing wrong with kind of falling back on your ethnicity, on your locality, on your nation, to give you solace and reassurance about who you are and where you fit. There's not obviously anything wrong with it. I think it's useful, and just pick up from the separatism panel earlier in the week. One of the things that's emerged is that nationalities or conflicts among peoples in a variety of countries around the world, most countries around the world, that have been kind of hidden or buried or ignored for a long time, they're coming back up to the surface for one reason or another. 20 years ago in Turkey, Kurds didn't exist. You didn't use the term. They were mountain Turks. An official policy to more or less just ignore that there was ever such a people. Well, that's changed. And it changed in part as a result of policies by the present government of Turkey to liberalize the way that Turkey's Kurds could be talked about. While I was serving there, for the first time, people would talk about the Kurdish question. When I first arrived and used the term the Kurdish question, I was exoriated. By the end of my time, people were talking about that. But these hidden things there, or Swedes in Finland, or the Silesian minority in the Czech Republic, or they're all over the place. And some of that's coming out more in the open, and that's a good thing, at least in general. And I think also an opportunity for peoples to maybe reassess the arrangements that they have. The Scots, reassessing, and maybe to some extent together with the other subjects of the United Kingdom, reassess that relationship. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Or for Flemish and Walloons to reassess, is this a good idea that we're in one country? At a certain level, there's nothing obviously wrong with that. It's healthy, just as to some extent, maybe to a large extent, we're reassessing who we are, even though we're, for the reasons you referred to earlier, what we stand for and what our identity is.
I'm going to ask one more question for this discussion section, then I'd like to leave a little time for the two of you, if you have questions for each other, to pose them before we open to the audience here. Going off of what you said earlier, Ambassador Wilson, about nationalism potentially being an unfortunate response to the failures of leadership, one of the positions of a lot of anti-liberal nationalists, those who dislike the liberal order that rose up after World War II, is that forcing people to let go of those allegiances to blood, to religion, is an unnatural act. It's the sort of thing that is any other type of association, if it's to ideals instead of blood or faith, it's going to require a great deal, a heroic effort of persuasion to get people to commit to living in a society founded on ideals instead of history, blood, these more let's say, primordial drives. And if, in their mind, in that case, to let go of those primordial ties requires constant growth. It requires perfectly functioning government. It requires money. Is there truth to that? Couldn't that be a very dangerous situation if we find ourselves needing extraordinary performance of society and government to keep those ethnic ties at bay?
Not too sure how to attack this. The idea of forcing people to give up their sense of nationhood, their sense of ethnicity, or anything else, that's ridiculous. And I think American nationalism is historically, and you can speak better of this than I can as an historian, but it has to do with our values. It also was forged in wars that we fought: a war of independence, a war of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. Each of those rallying points that had something to do with forging a sense of nationhood. I was reading a book recently, What Hath God Wrought? It's a history of America in the early 1800s. And there's a section where it talks about the telegraph and the role that the telegraph had in forging a sense of nationhood, because for the first time you could communicate from one side to another. Anyway, government has to deliver. When it fails to deliver, citizens look elsewhere for answers. They fall back on they fall back on their nationalities. They fall back on their ethnicities. They fall back on their tribe. In the Middle East, especially, we like sectarian violence in the Middle East. That's where it comes from, and from failure of government to deliver. So I come back to my point. Democrats have to deliver. Liberal society has to deliver, or it won't endure, and it will have problems for a variety of reasons, including the push and pull of sectarian, ethnic, nationality, and other differences.
You know, let me come at this also from a glass half full perspective, which is to say, if we're seeing a rise of smaller and smaller identity politic problems around the world, people who are clamoring for their own nation or clamoring for their own nation in a state that already existed to be more first and foremost in their minds. Frankly, that only happens at the end of a really good time or during a really good time. Most people in this world have forgotten World War II, or at least there's not many people around who were there during World War II. And the president referred to in his inaugural address as the carnage. I think we've actually forgotten what real carnage looks like around the world. And there's a sense in which I think we could say that this prosperity that we have seen globally, and frankly, the global lack of violence that we have seen around the world. I mean, because everybody has a camera on their phone right now, we can see any act of violence that occurs around the world. But statistically, violence, wars, and threats of both are dramatically down historically throughout the world, and prosperity and standard of living is dramatically up throughout the world. The fact that we have people around the world who have an average lifespan into the 50s and 60s and 70s, as opposed to when it was in the 20s and 30s, frankly gives people more time to think of more things to be upset about. So let's pat ourselves on the back a little bit, and also, as you say, keep it going. But let's remember that these are, for lack of a better phrase, what we like to call first world problems. We've made the whole world into a first world problem.
I'd like to give you a few moments if you had anything to ask each other.
Questions from the audience, or however you want to proceed.
Yes. Well, with that,
One will be interesting to others.
let's do that. Will give us, I suppose, a few more minutes for what I'm sure will be some interesting questions from the audience. In this session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions. To ask a question in the app system, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. I will get that up here on the stage. You may also raise your hand here in the audience and request a note card and a pencil from one of our two producers. Here, they're standing in the back ready. You please must write legibly. And if you are a student, please do put a note of that in your question and keep your questions brief and to the point. Let's take a question right at the top of the list to get us going. If you can generalize, what are the implications of the resurgence of nationalism to the corporate sector? That's something we actually haven't heard too much of in our conversation today.
I would be hard-pressed to, off the top of my head, to identify particular consequences from of the rise of nationalism in the corporate sector. The world economy is now dominated by multinational corporations that operate all over the world. Most of them work hard to have a multinational identity. Sometimes they highlight their American identity when they need help from the U.S. government, but overseas they work hard. American companies work hard, and by the same token, European companies work hard here to look and see and feel and act like they're of the local place, because that's good business. So I don't see much sign of of any negativity or beggar thy neighbor or we're better than you. That's not what the corporate world is. Big business all around the world depends on an integrated global economy, which in essence is the antithesis of that the kind of negative nationalism that Heather and Jeff have referred to earlier.
I actually would look at it from a different perspective to say that it is absolutely true that all corporations want to make money. That's what they seem to do. They also want to become people, but that's a different question. But what's really interesting to me about this surge of nationalism and the changes within the international order, and I think Brexit is one of the best places to see that, is that you cannot actually say that Britain leaving the European Union is good or bad for business. You have to ask which business and in what place. And I think what we're going to see is that, as with all changes in the capitalist economy, there are going to be winners and losers from the surge of nationalism. Hopefully not more losers than winners, but it is going to reinforce the idea that it's axiomatic to say that capitalism is about creative destruction, that there are going to be, in aggregate, hopefully more winners than losers, but nationalism will help sort out which ones those are.
So a question that is certainly more directed to Ambassador Wilson. How did Turkey go from close relationship with the EU and Germany and potential EU membership to rising nationalism and an increasingly fraught relationship with the EU?
Two separate sets of issues, and I'll try to be brief on both of them. One is what happened to Turkey and Europe. And I think two things, two potholes appeared on Turkey's voyage to become a member of the European Union. One was extremely hostile public opinion in a number of European countries. Austria, I think it was 80%, several years ago anyway, 80% of the population strongly opposed to Turkish accession, but also very strong anti-Turkish membership public opinion in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, in a number of the East European countries as well. Some of that's xenophobia, some of that is anti-Muslim sentiment, but it was a fact, and it was something that European governments had to deal with. The more proximate cause for the Turkey-EU breakdown were decisions that the EU made at the end of 2006, and then a couple of years later to essentially freeze or take off the table large areas, a large set of topics that you negotiate when you're becoming a member of the European Union. European Council decided there are like 35 chapters that you negotiate of the European acquis that you negotiate, or actually what you do is you adopt EU rules. And but there is a process of negotiation, and EU leaders decided that first, I think it was 7 chapters, and then another 15 or so could not open. The formal discussions could not open and could not close. Of course, it's hard to close something you don't open, but that essentially there could be no progress on these, ostensibly over issues related to Cyprus, but in fact, decisions that were promoted by the Austrians, the Germans, the French, and others, using the cover of Cyprus to put an end to this. And that ended up just, the process won't work when it's like that. And it ended up exacerbating Turkey's keenly, highly developed sense of nationalism in kind of the worst form. It ended up halting the process of, or contributing anyway, to the halt of Turkish economic and political liberalization. A huge strategic mistake, I think, on the part of the Europeans, who had a lever, leaving aside the question of whether Turkey was ever going to get into the EU, they had a lever to encourage the right kind of change, which if it had gone on for a number of years longer, I think might have led Turkey in quite a different direction from where it is today.
I'm going to move to another question, and unless, Jeff, you had something else to add to the Turkey?
What he said.
I thought it was good too. From a student, and we can start with you, Jeff, with this question. What are your opinions on implementing a point system in regard to immigration? You were talking about us bringing the best.
You know, as with all things, the devil's in the details, and I guess it depends what you're giving points for. Personally, I like a system where we give points, if you will, for people who are coming here for educational opportunities who are then going to stay and build businesses or advance research. I am not comfortable, and this is, I was about to say, because I'm an American, I am not comfortable with the idea of giving out visas based upon how much money you can bring into the country. That strikes me as antithetical to our values. So I'm in favor of, if you will, thinking about how people should be allowed in and thinking about how we get the best people in. But I want us to be very careful about how we define best. And in my definition, it's those who are most likely to contribute. Yes. I also would like to point out that one of the things that I get somewhat emotional about in talking about this is, and we're talking about American nationalism, I think we're trained in some ways almost to not want to say out loud that we love our country, that somehow that's gauche, that the other side says it so much that we know that they don't actually believe it, they just say it reflexively, so we don't want to say it at all. My family were refugees, and this was the only country that would take us in. So I'm really uncomfortable with saying that we're going to close off the country to anyone who is willing to abide by our values.
We've received a couple of questions phrased in different ways about the role of climate change in fueling nationalism. So because we're getting a number of questions about that topic, I thought I would throw that out there to either of you.
You know, my understanding, my understanding is that as the climate changes, we're going to see new places of tension and conflict. When there is tension and conflict, people will oftentimes devolve back to their tribal sensibilities in this country or in any country. So climate change should be a generator of more conflict, which is why we should work extra hard to find ways to ameliorate our conflicts before they get bigger. I mean, it's simple, but it's much easier said than done.
Question from a student. If the resurgence of nationalism is due to an American crisis of identity, which I believe it is, how do we reform a national identity? And why did we lose it in the first place? That's a big one.
I tell you, I don't think we lost it. I really don't. But I think that there is a segment of the population who believe that by virtue of being an American, which they defined not based upon ideology, but based upon other characteristics, typically race or gender in particular, but race in particular, that they were somehow owed prosperity. The truth of the matter is that this was always designed to be a meritocracy where, yes, you could also have great advantages to people who already had achieved merit in previous generations. There's no leveling in the playing field per se. And so I don't think that we've lost a sense of nationalism. I think that we have to remind people that nationalism, and American nationalism, does not get defined strictly by race or ethnicity. It should be defined strictly by allegiance to values, not to the flag. I don't mean allegiance in a jackbooted thug way, but rather allegiance to the set of principles that the country was founded on.
I agree with that, and I think the other, to repeat a little bit of what I said in my opening remarks, we need in this country for American nationalists who believe in the United States and what it stands for, to ensure that government functions effectively, that we solve our problems, that we work with others in the world who share some of those problems and who will partner with us in solving them. And any other, and to argue vociferously against those who maintain otherwise.
Another question related to this topic of how American national identity in a good sense. We did have a question about what is good and bad in nationalism. I feel like we've kind of hashed through that a bit. But another question was, what role might reinstating the draft play in helping solidify a diverse society and also instill patriotic values?
Okay, let me say that I have a flight to catch, which is good, because I will be running out after you hear this answer, hopefully with nobody tailing me. So I am completely 1,000% in favor of national service. What I am particularly worried about, as a person who has a really better sense than the average American, to be completely honest, it's the end of the day, so I'll say that, of what the founders actually thought. So you can win any argument in politics of today by saying the founders said, and almost invariably when someone tells you the founders said, they didn't. Or it's a much diverse opinion, but here's one thing that they were generally in agreement with, that the real root cause of conflict coming from nationalism had to do with militarism. And consequently, what was really a front to civil liberties for the founding generation was a standing army. And the idea that everybody would be required to spend time in an army, not just for defense, but as a way of inculcating proper values, would have been completely antithetical, especially to people like George Washington, who knew a thing or two about what role the military could play in forming some virtues, but not all. So national service is fine, but I think we do need to ask ourselves in our country if we have not gone too far, and I think too far out of defensiveness and fear, if you will, of being chastised. For example, somebody has to say, I'm about to leave before I say this, in genuflecting to the military and to military service as not just as the highest form of service, but as the only form of service. This man here spent 30 years in public service. Teachers spend a lot of time in public service. Nurses spend a lot of time in public service. I am bothered tremendously by presidents, Republican and Democrat, who look out on a sea of, let's say, West Point cadets or a sea of Marines in Iwo Jima and say, you are the best the country can produce. Because that tells people that you can only be among the best if you are wearing a uniform, and there are other ways to serve the country. And frankly, the moment that we forget that, I think, is the moment that we go down a particular dangerous road of nationalism, and that we should remember that there are a variety of ways that patriotism can be expressed, and they don't just require wearing a uniform. I'm going.
Did you want to add to that, Ambassador Ross? I saw you taking notes. Ambassador Wilson, excuse me.
I think I've lived in countries that have universal conscription. Soviet Union did, Turkey did. We know a number of other places. And Turks would certainly argue that that universal military service helped to foster Turkish nationhood with respect to the modern Republic of Turkey, including because Turkey's diverse multi-ethnic population all kind of got squeezed together into this thing. The Kurds and the Laz and Turkey's a highly multi-ethnic country. They all kind of were together, and they all were forced to do something for their country. I think, especially in Turkey, that legacy is one of many things that has undermined Turkish democracy, because that tradition and that respect to the military, in effect, legitimized repeated military interventions that stunted Turkish democracy, and not to mention cost a lot of lives. I think one of the things about American identity we would call freedom, and that includes the freedom to opt out. We have had a national draft at times of acute national emergency. And my guess is that most Americans would support a national draft, again, if and when there is a time of acute national emergency. And in the absence of that, I think it's a dumb idea, and contrary to what our country stands for.
Yes.
Just also, please be aware when this question comes up that nobody is more against a national draft than the Pentagon. They don't want to deal with that many people who are untrained and unfit. They want to be able to select which of their volunteers come in, and they want people who actually want to be there. So you will not find an officer who has not yet retired and is not getting paid to say it, say that they're in favor of bringing in everyone.
To bring things up to date, we received one question. Professor Engel discussed the use of trade to achieve codependency and avoidance of war. President Trump railed against the TPP and withdrew the United States from the negotiations. Now he wants back in. Why do you think he has changed his position?
Okay, I'll tell you exactly why he changed his position, because the people in the room, that's what he thought they wanted to hear. He was talking to Midwestern senators from farm states, and they were telling him, please, Mr. President, we need to stop this tariff thing, and one good suggestion would be to perhaps think about getting back into TPP. And he looked at them, and they looked at him, and he looked at them, and he said, I think that's what they want to hear. He did not believe it. He's not going to do it. Now, let me take a step back by suggesting that if he did want to do it, it would actually be a sign that he is learning in office, because no, I mean that quite literally. I want all presidents and all policymakers to learn while in office. I want them to have new information and to be open to new ideas. And my suspicion, were he to be genuine in this thought, would be that somebody finally got the chance to explain to him what the TPP actually was, not what he thought it was. So, for example, every issue that he is battling with current trade skirmish, we're not at a trade war yet, trade skirmish with China, every single issue would be better fought on the American side with 11 other allies on our side, not unilaterally. And I think he's finally perhaps been told that. By the way, I haven't checked his Twitter in the last 10 minutes, but I don't believe for a second that he actually thinks about actually getting into it, the TPP.
And I absolutely agree. It's it's an excellent description of where things are. The ability of the United States to get back into this agreement is, I think, highly questionable. There were a set of balances that got struck. That's what you do in trade negotiations. We give here, we get there. When we walked away, the remaining countries struck their own balances to suit themselves. The price for America to get in now will be higher than it was in January 2017. And to think that we're going to get a better deal than we got then is just completely crazy. So we've made, the president has made a significant mess that if he wishes to go down this road, and I'm inclined to believe that there'll be less that meets the eye in terms of returning to TPP, it will be extremely difficult for the United States to successfully work out something that's better than what we had before.
A final question, and this is to summarize a number that we've received on note cards and through the app. What impact does economic inequality have on nationalism?
I think it's a significant source of extreme nationalist sentiment, as are other changes that are taking place in our economy, job loss, technological transformation, the pace of change, the feeling that people get left out. I get a lot of that in flyover country, and maybe to some extent you get that here, a feeling that there's stuff going on, I'm not in control anymore, America's going somewhere else. You see that in other parts of the world too, and I think it's a basket of things. It's not just one, but income inequality and worsening income equality. It's not just that it exists, but it's worsened substantially over the last 15, 20 years in this country. It is a source, and it's not. It's something, if we want to try to counteract negative things that we don't like, we need to find ways to address that, along with all those other things.
I would agree with that, and also add that one other element of income inequality is income inequality for opportunity. So remember, one of the things that we all know Americans touted quite loudly throughout the 20th century and even before was the idea that anybody could make it here and that we had more social and economic mobility than any other country. Not true anymore. Used to be true, but not true anymore. It's actually really disturbing as an American nationalist, I'll adopt the term now for the last question, to see that you have greater opportunity to move up the economic and social food chain in Britain, a country that was famously static, than in the United States statistically these days. And I can only think, as you said, that one way to reduce the dangers of militant nationalism would be to reduce the lack of opportunity that people are perceiving.
Well, I must mention briefly that it started what was just a little more than 15 minutes ago. There is a party taking place. You are all invited. It's on the Hill celebrating the 70th anniversary of the CWA. There are Hill restaurants that are serving free food. There's music being performed. This is open to everyone between 4 and 6 o'clock today. But before you do that, please join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful panelists here. Thank you.